I want you to imagine that you are a primitive person living in a primitive city 7,000, maybe more years ago. Let's say you're a shepherd and you're out with your flock and you can see the city from the hillside. And then all of a sudden, a fiery serpent streaks across the sky and explodes right over your city, evaporating everything. Well, that actually happened at Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's what we're talking about this week.
Everybody is trying to take advantage of everybody else.
Hello all, I'm the Mad Pastor, and Christianity sucks. It's boring, it's irrelevant, it's out of date, but it doesn't have to be. Let me explain why. This week we are talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities that were destroyed by the angels of the Lord for their sinfulness, and we will be reading from Genesis chapter 19, 1 through 29. But before I read it, let me tell you what I'm going to read you, because it's a big one and people can get lost in it. And so let me give you some context and just tell you what I'm about to read before I read it. So these three guys come to visit Abraham, and he is hospitable towards them. He gives them bread, he gives them wine, all of those things that you're supposed to do to be a hospitable, welcoming Arab-type person. And hospitality is huge in Hebrew culture. And so those three men turn out to be God and two angels, and then they take Abraham to this place where he can see Sodom and Gomorrah, and then the Lord says that he's going to destroy the town because of their wickedness. And Abraham has this kind of exchange with him and basically argues God down to, if he can find 10 righteous men in Sodom, then he won't destroy it. And so that happens to be where Lot is living, Abraham's nephew, and the two angels go into town and they visit Lot, and Lot says, "Stay with me," and they're like, "Nah, we'll stay in the square." He says, "No, seriously, stay with me. You're going to want to sleep in my house." And the whole city comes after these two men because they want to rape them. They want to pull them out and gang rape them. And Lot goes so far in defending them that he's going to offer his own daughters, who have not yet been married and not yet, they're virgins. And he says, "You can do whatever you want with them, but leave these guys alone," which is crazy. But then it turns out that those two men were angels. They pull Lot in, they strike everyone with blindness, and then they get Lot and his family out of there, and they completely wipe out the city. They utterly destroy it for its sinfulness and wickedness. So that's a summary of the context before Genesis 19 and then what we're going to read. So if you want to skip ahead, I'm going to read the whole thing because I'm hardcore, like I say every week. But if you want to skip ahead, because I just told you basically everything you need to know, just use the little navigation things. But for those of us who are hardcore, let's read the Bible. All right, we are reading from Genesis chapter 19, verses 1 through 29, and they sound like this. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city, bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of the city." But he lingered, so the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and left him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, they said, "Flee for your life, do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, your servant has found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I cannot flee to the hills, for I fear disaster will overtake me and I die. Look, that city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Very well, I grant you this favor too, and will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I can do nothing until you arrive there." Therefore the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot went to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. All right, let's start to make sense of this thing. Let's talk about the structure and the content. So first of all, remember that the book of Genesis was not so much written as it was edited. There were lots of cultural stories that the Israelites had brought with them. And remember, this was written years and years and years and years and years, millennia after anything like this ever actually happened. So really what's going on is the writer of Genesis is taking different sources, J and P is what we traditionally call them, the Yahwist and the priestly tradition, and kind of editing them together to make one cohesive narrative. And this one is kind of crowbarred into the Abraham story. It really belongs more in line with the flood and the Tower of Babel story. That's probably the tradition that this story came out of. But the editor kind of like crowbars it into the Abraham story and puts Lot and Abraham as characters in the midst of this story. They probably weren't originally, and that's just a guess. We'll never know, but that's my guess. So what's going on here is there are themes that we've seen before, the Tower of Babel and the flood. There's wickedness, and God needs to destroy it. There's wickedness that is associated with a city, and a city that's getting big and too big for its britches. And there's this corollary between every time people start to get together in a city and an organized structure, that it starts to become wicked. It inherently has sin, not just from the individual people, but like almost systemic sin that God needs to destroy. But God will rescue and be kind to Lot, the Lots of the world, who are actually trying to be righteous and sinless in the midst of this systemic sin. So that's kind of the overarching. So let's talk about that. Next section. I want to talk about what actually probably historically happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Just about 10 years ago in Russia, we have footage, and I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to edit it in. This is a meteorite streaking through the sky and exploding, thankfully, over an unpopulated area, but even the shockwave from that explosion made it to the populated area. And it exploded not by hitting the ground, but it exploded above the ground in the atmosphere because of the atmospheric friction. This is probably what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah. It's also probably what happened that caused this worldwide flood that all these cultures talk about. So Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plains was probably a real place. And there is actual evidence that a guy found. Hold on, let me find it. The city is called Tal el Hammam, and the people who are studying it think it was Sodom. They see evidence that it was destroyed by some kind of astronomical event. There's literally a layer in the dirt where you can see ash and destruction. You can see the layer that exploded where there's crystallized like diamonds and there's all kinds of stuff that I don't really know about that is evidence of some kind of incredible heat blast, like above 2,000 degrees Celsius kind of heat that vaporized this entire city and this entire population. That's probably what happened. This was probably rooted in an actual event. And then the people of the book were like, how do we even explain something like this? A serpent from the sky that explodes the city? Well, they make sense of it the way that everyone throughout history has made sense. It must be an act of God. We don't understand it. It's an act of God. And so then they start to attach meaning. It must have been all the wickedness of those cities. It must have been all of the sinful things they were doing, because why would God do such a thing if it wasn't like... And so you can hear the logic, and then from that, they start to make meaning. They start to actually have a way to relate with this God, with this powerful force of creation and destruction. How can we have a relationship with a living God? And how can we get people not to do like human sacrifices and horrible things to each other? And that's kind of how these stories began. Okay, let's talk about the sin of Sodom. Traditionally, this has been associated with sodomy, butt sex, but that's actually a relatively new interpretation, going all the way back to 1400, the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer. Sodomy in that time was interpreted as any sex act that was not vaginal intercourse for procreation. Anything that was pleasurable, anything that was outside of the vagina, like penis and vagina, anything other than that was considered sodomy and sinful. This attachment of sodomy, the word sodomy, the sin of Sodom, to gay people and gay sex and gay relationships is inaccurate. That's actually that is not what's going on in this text. And if you just read the story, you can go through the story. It's obvious that it has nothing to do with a specific sex act, and has everything to do with the whole system has failed. The writer makes a point of saying every single person in the whole city, like that's an exaggeration, but he's trying to make the point. The whole entire city had gone bad. They had become systemically sinful. So it's probably more of a generalized wickedness that God is portrayed in this story as hating and destroying, but this is the idea that it's specifically associated with sodomy as we understand it today, like butt sex, basically. I don't know what else, anal intercourse, I guess. But that idea is just not. It's not accurate, and it's a relatively new understanding, historically speaking. It's not what the original readers and the original writer would have intended or interpreted. All right, let's talk a little bit about Zohar and the theme that this introduced. So the primary literary structures in this are contrast. What we have here are two really important contrasts, and they're the contrast between how Lot treats his guests and how the other people of the city treat their guests. The other contrast is Zohar versus Sodom. Lot makes this big point, and the storyteller makes this big point of saying that Lot was supposed to flee into the hills, but he begs to go to Zohar. And he doesn't even, it's not even called Zohar yet. He wants to go to this other city because he doesn't want to go out into the wilderness. He's afraid of it. It's scary, but he wants to be with other people in a city. And he says, well, what about that one? It's little. And that's the contrast of a little city or a town versus a big city. And so one of the themes that happens in these early stories from Genesis is there seems to be an assumption that as a city grows and as people gather together more and more and more and become less dependent on the wilderness and more dependent upon things like agriculture and farming and city walls and big towers, it sounds like God hates big cities and likes little towns. But here's what's really going on. Culturally, and I talked about this at the Tower of Babel, so check that out. Check out the Tower of Babel if you really want a full description of this. Essentially, cities were city-states, and they were a class system. There was aristocracy, and there was the haves and the have-nots, and there was slavery, and there was oppressive. The only way you get big in this time of history is by conquering other people, making them slaves, working them literally to death, and throwing their bodies out into the fields to fertilize the soil as maybe a sacrifice to the gods. So there is an appropriate correlation, historically speaking, between large cities that are building up this way and what it takes, because you got to remember, with farming comes sacrifice. And a lot of times in these large cities, with farming comes human sacrifice. So that's what's associated here. It's not that God doesn't like cities. It's that God hates when power structures become oppressive and hierarchically oppressive. Like, if you're born into this family, then you're good. If you're born into this family, then we're going to kill you to appease the gods. That's really what is the sin that's happening in Sodom. The other clue to this theme of God hating that type of sin in Sodom is the contrast between Lot and the rest of the city. Lot sees foreigners, sees people who are strangers in a strange land, and he says, "Please come inside, let me take care of you." The whole rest of the city sees foreigners, strangers in a strange land, sees them as vulnerable and wants to take advantage of them, wants to literally gang rape them. Lot stands at the door in front of the entire city and says, "You can't come in, don't touch them, please, don't harm them." And then, this is very problematic in modern context, but you got to understand we're dealing with an ancient story and an ancient understanding of cultural values. And so the idea that Lot would offer his daughters certainly isn't like a wonderful thing, but it is intended to be shocking, but it also would have been like, oh, what a good guy Lot is. We would hear it now and go, what a horrible, evil thing to even consider. And rightfully so, because we have a better understanding and I think a stronger morality around whether or not your daughter is a human being and not property. But in that day and age, the idea is this is casting Lot as a very self-sacrificing hero, because he's willing to even give up his daughters in order to protect these two men. So the contrast of, if we can get kind of past the audacity of that and look at what the writer intended, we have a contrast of Lot, who sees vulnerability and wants to protect it and defend it and take care of it, and the rest of the city who sees vulnerability and says, "I shall take advantage of that and take what I want from it, because might equals right." That's the sin of Sodom. That's why God hated Sodom and wanted to destroy it in this city. So I think it's safe to say God hates systemic oppression. And everywhere that we find it, we are called to be Lot. We're called to be the one who stands against it. Now, it's difficult because it's systemic. It's inlaid. It's part of like our whole surrounding and context. And so a lot of those things get really hard. Things like racial oppression, things like gender-based oppression, things like sexuality-based oppression. And so we are called to be people who stand up for what we believe to be right. And also we're called to be people who understand that maybe our neighbor is going to disagree with us, and that doesn't mean that they're evil or sinful. It just means that they're different. Unless, of course, they want to gang rape your guests, then they're evil. So anyway, I've been the Mad Pastor, and this has been my take on Sodom and Gomorrah, and I leave you with this blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.